Welcome everyone to this joint CSEN Karma webinar, which is supposed to be by Dan Andrews from the OECD on the topic of COVID-19 productivity and reallocation, hibernation or zombification. Unfortunately, Dan is having some technical issues, but luckily for us and unluckily for him, Angus Moore, his co-author, is going to step in until he can get things sorted out. So before we begin, I'd like to acknowledge and celebrate the first Australians on whose traditional lands we meet and pay our respects to their elders past and present. So my name is Renee Fry-McKibben and I'm a Professor of Economics at the Crawford School of Public Policy at the ANU. And I would also like to introduce Ozer Karigadaliki from CSEN. Our speaker today is supposed to be Dan from the OECD, but I'll give you his introduction because we're expecting him to arrive soon. So he's the head of the Structural Policy Analysis Division at the OECD, where he leads teams to analyse the drivers of productivity and employment growth, with an emphasis on the role of digital technologies, structural reform and recessions. From 2018 to 20, he was Chief Advisor on Structural Reform and Macroeconomic Policy at the Australian Treasury, where he led an effort to integrate large-scale microdata sources into the policy process, served as co-chair of the OECD Global Forum on Productivity, and represented Australia on the OECD Economic Policy Committee. His research exploits microdata to assess the causes of the global productivity slowdown and the impact of structural reforms on growth. He was a central banker at the RBA for a decade and undertook graduate studies at Harvard before joining the OECD. Before I hand over to Angus, I'd like to let you know that this event is being recorded and will be available on the Karma website in the next few days. So if you'd like to ask a question, please use the Q&A button on the Zoom. And if you'd like to ask your question in person on the screen, send me a private chat and I'll invite you to ask your question. Okay, so Angus, sorry to do this to you, but I will hand over to you.
Thank you for having me all today. Hopefully Dan turns up so you can have who was actually supposed to be here, but I will take over briefly in his stead. My name's Angus. I'm co-author with Dan on one of the papers that we're talking about today. My other co-author, Andrew Charlton from Accenture, I don't think is with us today, but was also part of that paper. The other paper is some work with colleagues of Dan's from Treasury. Jonathan's on the line and I will throw him under the bus for any questions about that aspect of it. What we're going to be talking about today is two papers that look at very similar questions using two different data sets. So really what we're focusing on is how COVID-19 is going to affect potential output and productivity. Now, there are numerous channels through which this could happen. Dan's listed a whole bunch of them on this slide very helpfully. Most of these are very long run and the sort of things that we're just not going to be able to observe yet. Things like changes in migration, impacts on schooling, returns to investments that were undertaken or not undertaken during the past 18 months. All of that sort of stuff is, decade to decades horizon. What we're going to focus on with this paper is a sort of shorter run, but still very important channel for productivity growth. And that's the sort of cleansing effect of recessions. Typically we think about recessions as often the impetus for reallocation, the kind of Schumpeterian creative destruction idea. And so what we're examining is whether COVID-19 functioned as this kind of reallocation shock, where this shock to all firms and the economy more broadly forces the least productive out of business, frees up the labor and potentially capital in those firms to flow to the more productive firms. That's sort of the traditional view of how recessions affect reallocation and productivity. There are other channels though, and they can run in the opposite direction. One of the kind of idea is that we saw during the global financial crisis is you get sort of a loss of young firms because they don't have access to finance. And so you kind of get this scarring effect from recessions where you lose productive firms. So those are sort of two hypotheses, both of which or the balance of which we want to test. The other reason this question is important is COVID's been quite different from a typical recession along a number of dimensions for many reasons, including the fact that we're giving this seminar from my spare bedroom instead of from a seminar room somewhere. But that's that we've experimented with large-scale job retention policies here in Australia and in other countries. These have been a feature of the pandemic response in numerous countries. Those policies, by design, it's right in the title, prioritize preservation of employer-employee links over that reallocation channel. And so one of the sort of concerns about these policies as a recession fighting tool is that they could lead to sort of zombification of firms and the economy. So, you know, this is the sort of context in which we're undertaking these two papers. As a sort of primer, you know, broadly speaking, market economies, OECD here, exhibit two kind of key features in more normal times. So one is a high rate of job reallocation. So in a typical year, something like 1 in 5 jobs are reallocated. You know, we see a large number of jobs. We see a large amount of gross job creation and gross job destruction. And together those net out to, you know, net employment growth somewhere in the order of 2 to 3% for Australia, you know, similar for other countries depending on population. This reallocation and this churn in the labour market gives a lot of scope for reallocation of labour from low productivity to higher productivity firms. And typically that's what we see in normal times. There is a sort of positive correlation between firm level productivity and job growth. This is important, you know, as this last point on the slide points out, you know, recessions are costly, job destruction is costly, changing jobs is costly. And so for this very high rate of churn and, you know, typical high rate of churn to be a good thing, we want it to be related to reallocation, to productivity enhancing reallocation, which is what we see. Now, the question for us is, has that been the case during COVID? Which you can tell these are not my slides because it's literally on the next slide that's the question that we're proposing. So one is, were these two things related? And two is, what was the impact of job retention schemes on this link? So this research stream is kind of two papers. Sorry, was there a question there? Or? Two papers. So one, the one that I worked on, which uses zero data, and a second one which uses single touch payroll data with, from the Treasury with Jonathan Haber and Elif Bar. Zero, for those that don't know, is a small business accounting platform. So it's cloud-based, you know, enterprise resource planning, I suppose, broadly speaking, similar to things like Quicken Books or MYOB. Zero is very large, has more than 1 million subscribers in Australia and more than 2.5 million globally. So we can see kind of the backside of it. So firms put their data into Zero. So that includes things like sales, other revenue, expenses. And then some firms use it to manage their payroll. So we can observe every pay slip they issue, you know, characteristics about the worker, characteristics about the firm, etc.
So, Angus, I think Dan is online now under Jonathan, so we can let you off the hook.
Dan, are you there?
You're just on mute, Dan.
Can you hear me? Hello?
Yes, can hear you.
Okay, sorry about this. Angus, how about you and Jonathan continue this slide and I'll jump in after that.
Sounds great. So yeah, the first paper on this slide here, undertaken with Dan, myself, and Andrew, we use data from these smaller firms, all of which use Zero. We can see revenues, we can see hours worked and employment. We have coverage across a wide range of industries and a very large number of firms. And crucially for this paper, we have coverage of firms in Australia, New Zealand, and the UK, all on a comparable basis because they're all using the same accounting software. So we observe variables in the same way. And that will give us a cross-country dimension to kind of compare outcomes through the crisis. Jonathan, did you want to talk about SDP data?
Yep, sure. So the other paper, which is Dan, myself, and Elif Bahar from Treasury, we use single touch payroll data. So that's that's provided by the ATO, and it effectively covers pretty much the universe of firms in Australia. So basically every time someone puts in a pay slip for their job, that's kind of gets recorded in the data, so we can kind of see at a very high frequency how many people are employed, what their wages are, and then the really cool thing that we're able to do is we're able to actually integrate that with other data on the firm. So based off their business income tax data histories, we can calculate measures of productivity for the firms and link that to the employees and the employment outcomes, as well as then linking that also to administrative data on JobKeeper. So as like this allows us to use to produce monthly metrics on employment, link that to the productivity of the firm. It's obviously a really highly representative sample, so it's pretty much covers the universe of employing firms. And using the income tax data, as I said, we can construct measures such as turnover, value added, which allow us to make measures of productivity. But we can also look historically at firms' financial health, things like their liquidity, and then understand whether that's affected their kind of probability of survival, but also probability of opting into schemes like JobKeeper. So I think that probably covers off the basics of that paper, the data. Sorry.
Great. Angus, should I share my screen now, or you just want to control it from here?
No.
Okay, so sorry for those technical issues. So essentially, with those two data sets in mind, this research project tries to address two key questions. So the first is, how did the pandemic affect productivity enhancing reallocation within narrowly defined sectors? And the overall finding there from both papers is that although job reallocation fell, it remained connected to firm productivity. So more productive firms are more likely to expand, and less productive firms are more likely to contract or exit over the course of the pandemic. So in a sense, this is consistent with a partial hibernation of the economy, but not a zombification. The second key finding is that we investigated how job retention schemes shaped this process. So what I mean by job retention scheme is, for instance, the JobKeeper scheme in Australia, the wage subsidy scheme in New Zealand, for instance. And what we find here is quite a nuanced result. So initially what we find is that during the crisis phase of the pandemic, so from say March 2020 to September 2020, we find evidence that, if anything, the JobKeeper scheme in Australia worked to prevent an indiscriminate shakeout of productive firms, and particularly financially fragile productive firms. And so I guess one of the potential kind of conclusions here is that, so we've got the problem that the counterfactual of what would have happened in absence of the policy support is not observable. But certainly the characteristics of the firms that took up the JobKeeper scheme is consistent with the idea that the shock may have seriously distorted market selection in absence of the policy support. But what we find is that, the longer the shock wears on, we find that these job retention schemes become more distortive over time. And, I'll show some evidence later on that shows that, when the JobKeeper scheme is phased out, you see a surge in the reallocation of labor from less productive firms. So, broadly speaking, this highlights the need to have a credible exit strategy if you're going to use schemes such as JobKeeper for crisis support. Okay, just before we move on, I just want to mention why we think, a couple of reasons why we think this research is important. So the first is that if you go back to the Great Recession, the seminal NBER paper on reallocation during the Great Recession arrived 6 years after Lehman Brothers collapsed in NBER working paper form. So what we've been able to do here through this collaborative venture is to shed light of the impact of the COVID recession on reallocation in about 15 months since the onset of the pandemic in countries like Australia. And by virtue of being able to do that, we've been able to have an influence on policy. An example of that is an article by John Keogh in the AFR about a month ago now, where he essentially uses a lot of this research to make the case against JobKeeper 3.0 returning. And this was in the context of the pandemic, which started to rip through the east coast of Australia. Okay, so before we sort of talk about what we find in the context of COVID, I think it's useful to have a brief recap on what the literature says about the impact of recessions on productivity enhancing reallocation. So on the one hand, there's the conventional view, which goes back to Schumpeter and was established empirically by Caballero and Hammer in the early 1990s, which makes the case that recessions can entail cleansing effects and essentially provide a fertile ground for restructuring to the extent that markets continue to select or scrap the least productive firms. So what we know from a range of US empirical studies conducted by the likes of Steve Davis and John Halterwanger is that as a broad approximation from the 1940s to the early 2000s recessions in the US, you see strong evidence of cleansing dynamics. So what we mean by that is that the overall rate of reallocation picks up to the extent that the rise in job destruction is greater than the fall in job creation. And we see a strong link with firm productivity. So particularly in the early 1980s recession, it becomes a lot more likely that low productivity firms contract or exit. Now, once you fast forward to the global financial crisis, there begins to be a reassessment of these cleansing dynamics. So what you see there is that the overall rate of job reallocation actually declines to the extent that the rise in job destruction is is less than the fall in job creation. And we see a sort of a much weaker link with productivity, particularly amongst young firms. So a key concern is that to the extent that there was damage to the financial sector during that recession, this led to a premature shakeout of young and financially fragile firms before they could reach their true potential. So this sort of fits in with the idea that recessions may be less benign for productivity to the extent that they can engender selling or scarring effects. And so that's sort of what we know, right? So this is, recessions can have cleansing or they can have scarring effects. This becomes an empirical issue. And I think this quote by Chad Sitterson, who's one of the world's experts on productivity, is quite instructive in the context of COVID. And he makes the point that a lot's going to depend on how this process of selection and survival plays out and to the extent it's conducted with productivity. So the point is that recessions are bad, right? There's a lot of destruction going on. But if you don't have a connection between this reallocation process and productivity, you don't get any of the upside, right? And it's just all loss. Next slide, thanks. Thanks, Angus. So the question then is, will the pandemic be different? So, and in both papers, we frame two questions here, the two hypotheses here, if you like. The first is that we think there's reasons to actually suspect the COVID shock severely disrupted the typical reallocation process. So there's a few dimensions to this, right? So firstly, this is an exogenous health shock. It has nothing to do with pre-shock economic weakness amongst firms. And you can imagine that these arbitrary lockdowns affected high and low productivity firms within a given sector similarly, regardless of their productivity, at least in the short run. The second aspect of this is that the use of job retention schemes in many OECD countries may have actually severed the reallocation productivity link. Certainly, we know that their modus operandi as a crisis support mechanism was to shut down job destruction. So this raises the possibility that that these schemes could actually sever the usual well-functioning mechanisms of the market economy. So that was the case. You'd expect there to see essentially no correlation between firm workforce adjustments and pre-shock firm productivity within sectors. Now, against this, you could imagine that there were aspects of the COVID shock that could work to reinforce cleansing dynamics. And I think the leading explanation here is that goes to the nature of the COVID shock, which is essentially technological. And we know that the COVID shock forced a wave of experimentation with different modes of business working, such as teleworking. And you can imagine that more productive firms, which are typically better managed, could more readily accommodate those organizational changes in a productive way. So if anything, you might continue to see that firm employment changes are correlated with productivity, and that could even intensify. Renee, was there any questions at all?
There are some.
I see some
they
chat
could,
things going.
yeah, they could probably wait till after the presentation if you want to get through some of your slides.
That might be useful given the technical issues we've got here.
Yeah.
Next slide. Thanks, Angus. Okay, so then the question is what do we know about this? So I think the best way to summarize this is that there's just a handful of studies around the world on this question. If anything, they're suggestive of the reallocation productivity link remaining intact over the course of the pandemic. But it's important to note that each of these studies have empirical and theoretical limitations. So a few of these studies aren't actually based on real data. They're based on firms' expectations of their expansion or contraction plans over coming months. And in other cases, these are based on kind of a very incomplete commercial data sets that just look at firm failure as opposed to the extensive margin of firm downsizing or expansion, which tends to be more important for reallocation. Next slide. Thanks, Angus. Okay, so firstly, let's start with what we know about what happened to the overall rate of job reallocation. So in both papers, what we find is that there's evidence that if anything, the rate of reallocation falls over the first part of the pandemic. So this slide is from zero, and we do a very crude exercise here, and we just look at the share of firms that are adding workers, so expanding, or contracting, so shedding workers, or don't change their headcount at all. And what we show here is basically the distribution of firm employment growth across those three categories between February and May 2020 versus the same period in 2019. The top panel basically just shows the raw shares. The bottom panel shows the difference between the 2 years. So if you look at New Zealand and the UK, for instance, over those first 3 or 4 months of the pandemic, what we see is an increase in the share of static firms. So that's actually consistent with the decline in reallocation in the economy. In Australia, we see kind of a much bigger swing from expanding to contracting, and I'll talk about why we think that's so later on. But I think the key thing to note is although there's evidence of an increase in the share of static firms in the economy, so less job reallocation, it's important to note that a non-trivial share of firms are still expanding or contracting over this period. So next slide, thanks, Angus. What we can then do is basically dig into the administrative tax data for Australia, and this sort of obviously looks at all firms in Australia, with the exception of owner-managers. And this is an updated chart from the 3-month JobKeeper review. And what we've done here is the left panel looks at all firms, and then panels B and C sort of focus on those firms that firstly were recipients of JobKeeper in panel B and those that weren't in panel C. And what's interesting to note here for Australia is that the JobKeeper scheme is announced at the end of March, so the 30th of March 2020. And before that, we see a massive rise in job destruction. The scheme is then announced, and then job destruction plummets. What we also see, obviously, is creation falls as well. And that gradually recovers through the back end of 2020 as the macro economy picks up. So again, this is consistent with the idea that the pandemic was associated with a decline in the overall rate of reallocation, certainly once these policy measures kicked in. Next slide, thanks. So what we then do is we try to understand how this reallocation process over the course of the pandemic is connected to firm productivity. And this essentially means we delve into the misallocation literature. I don't want to spend much time on this, but I think it's important to note that there's no single perfect way to measure productivity enhancing reallocation. We work within the early PACUS tradition, which looks at essentially the covariance between firm productivity and employment shares, but there are other approaches. Shane Clino was the vogue for a number of years there, but now there's been a reassessment about the reliability of that, and there's a more recent approach by Fari based on markups. Now, I think the important thing to note here is that across a range of OECD countries, there's a lot of credible empirical evidence that high productivity firms are more likely to expand and low productivity firms are more likely to contract or exit within narrowly defined sectors. And these empirical studies take their theoretical structure from the canonical models of firm dynamics, and also the adjustment cost literature. Now, one of the reasons why we work in the early Pecos tradition is for practical feasibility. And essentially, you know, what we need to do that is essentially to know about how employment evolves over the course of the pandemic, and then look at how that relates to a firm's pre-crisis position in the productivity distribution. There are caveats with this approach, which we discuss in the paper. I think the point is to say that we're aware of these. On the data side, we don't have TFP here. What we have is either turnover-based labour productivity, so sales per worker, or value added per worker. But we look in narrowly defined sectors, and we know that from the existing literature, using TFP doesn't change the results too much, and so forth. So let's move ahead to the results, or the model, if you like. So what we do is we estimate essentially a model that projects firm level employment growth over the course of the pandemic as a function of pre-pandemic labour productivity with a battery of fixed effects. So what we're doing here is that we're looking within narrowly defined sectors, controlling for state, country. In the case of zero, we have firm size controls, firm age controls, etc. And we follow the literature here. And essentially the way to think about this is that if the beta coefficient in labour productivity is positive and significant, well, that's evidence that within industry, labour reallocation is productivity enhancing. So what I mean by that is that it means that more productive firms are more likely to expand, and less productive firms are more likely to contract or exit. Now, we kind of take this basic model and then we run it in a variety of ways. So zero has the advantage of actually having some good pre-pandemic data. So what we do with zero is not only look at how firm employment is connected to productivity over the course of the pandemic, but we also compare that to the pre-pandemic period. And we can do things where we pull Australia, New Zealand, and the UK together. We can run country-specific models. We do all that in the paper. Obviously, when we turn to single-touch payroll for Australia, there's no country fixed effects in this. And whilst this is more comprehensive data in terms of covering all firms in the economy, we don't have the luxury of pre-pandemic employment data. So next slide, thanks, Angus. Okay, so what we have here is the baseline table from the single touch payroll paper for Australia based on administrative data. What I need you to take from this slide is that when you look at the change in employment from the onset of the pandemic in March 2020 to May 2021, the productivity coefficient is positive in the employment growth regression. So more productive firms are more likely to add workers, less productive firms more likely to shed workers over that period. And then in panel B, when we look at the probability of firm exit, the coefficient of productivity is negative. So less productive firms are more likely to exit. Columns 2 and 3 have a bit more of a flexible functional form here, where we look at essentially, instead of a linear measure of productivity, we have dummy variables for firms placed in the within industry labour productivity distribution. The omitted category here is the least productive quartile. So what we see here is that the coefficient becomes bigger and more positive in column 2 as we move towards the top of the productivity distribution. Angus, next slide, please. So graphically, another way to think about this is that we see big differences in the employment growth gap between the most productive and least productive firms. The way in which we do this is we define a high productivity firm as one with labour productivity 1 standard deviation above the industry mean, and low productivity is 1 standard deviation below. We then see that, for instance, on average, since the start of the pandemic, there's an 11-point employment growth gap there. The right-hand panel then shows the same thing for exit probability. Again, we see material differences. What we then do is cut this up by firm size, and there's some evidence of heterogeneity there. Next slide, thanks, Angus. So then when we go to zero, this is obviously cross-country data. We do a similar exercise. First thing to note here is that panel A looks at basically employment growth from February 2020 to February 2021. Panel B looks at it over the first three months of the pandemic, from February 2020 to May 2020. Columns 1 and 4 again show that on average, more productive firms are more resilient. What What we then do is we, in columns 2, we include a dummy variable, which is whether an industry is hard hit. So for instance, accommodation, food services, arts and rec. And certainly what we see there is over the first few months of the pandemic, there's, the connection between workforce churn and productivity is much stronger at hard hit industries, which is consistent with the Schumpeterian cleansing dynamic. The final columns then look at the cross-country heterogeneity. So the way to think about this is that the productivity coefficient by itself in columns 3 and 6 shows the impact in Australia. And then the dummy variable interactions for New Zealand and the UK down the bottom of the table shows the additional impact in those countries. So in column 6, over the first 3 months of the pandemic, what we see is that the interaction terms for New Zealand and the UK are negative and significant, which means that if anything, there's less productivity enhancing reallocation in those economies than Australia. But when you move over the course of the pandemic, these cross-country differences start to fade. And if anything, it becomes stronger in the UK. Next slide, thanks, Angus. Okay, so then one of the great things about Zero I mentioned is that we actually have pre-pandemic data. So what we then do is we have a look at, we investigate whether the pandemic is associated with an acceleration or deceleration in the extent of productivity enhancing reallocation. And we do this in the paper in a number of ways. I think this is a nice summary slide. So what we do here is we look at the estimated firm level employment change across the quartiles of the within industry productivity distribution. So for instance, on the left side there, we see that the lightest blue line is the most productive quartile, and in all countries, certainly that was more resilient. So, and certainly in Australia, we see big employment contractions in most of the least productive firms. Focusing on Australia, that gap between the most productive and least productive quartile becomes much bigger in 2020 than 2019, which suggests the extent of productivity enhancing reallocation in Australia actually accelerates initially over the course of the pandemic, at least relative to what happened the year before. By contrast, in New Zealand, we actually see smaller employment performance, a small employment gap between the most productive and least productive quartile in 2020 than we did in 2019. So that's sort of consistent with a deceleration in productivity enhancing reallocation dynamics. Angus, next slide, please. So the final thing we do is with Zero is that we know about whether how many apps a firm downloads. So that, for instance, these are e-commerce apps like Stripe or workforce management, cash flow management, and inventory apps like Square. And so what we do then is we have a look. We create a high tech dummy which equals 1 if a firm has downloaded 5 or more of these apps before the pandemic, and then we include that dummy in the baseline specification. It's interesting that we find a role for tech adoption here above and beyond the role of productivity and firm resilience. And I think that's interesting, right? Because usually you'd think tech adoption is fully reflected in productivity. And this might reflect the idea that app usage is a sign of a budding technological organizational capability that will only be reflected in higher labor productivity down the track. But certainly in the context of the COVID shock, where there was a premium on being online and operating remotely, you can imagine that this gave, for a given level of firm productivity, more tech-savvy firms an edge. Okay, Angus, next slide, please. Yeah, next one, thanks. Okay, so onto the role of job retention schemes. So there's 2 ways to think about this. So you can think about it in terms of the results from Zero, where we look at cross-country differences in productivity enhancing reallocation, and then you can relate those to the design of job retention schemes. Then certainly, what we know here is that New Zealand's wage subsidy scheme was the most broad-based in the OECD in terms of the share of the workforce it covered. So this, and we also know that New Zealand's wage subsidy scheme was introduced about a fortnight earlier than Australia's. So New Zealand introduced theirs in mid-March. JobKeeper in Australia wasn't announced till the end of March. So certainly that sort of stronger emphasis on preservation in New Zealand and Australia is consistent with the fact that productivity reallocation link actually kind of weakened in New Zealand over the course of the pandemic relative to beforehand. Whereas in Australia, we know that actually accelerated. Now the thing is that even once you look amongst that pool of workers in Australia that were potentially eligible for JobKeeper, you still see evidence of productivity enhancing reallocation dynamics. So there's a lot more going on here. And this is something that we address in the single touch payroll paper. Angus, can you go to the next slide, please? So what we find, as Jonathan mentioned early on, one of the great things about that data set is we know about whether the firm was a recipient of JobKeeper. So what we do then is we study the link between productivity enhancing reallocation and the take up of the JobKeeper scheme. And just to remind people, there's two broad or distinct phases of JobKeeper. So from April to September 2020, which is what we term JobKeeper 1.0, this is essentially broad-based crisis support to many firms in the economy. As many of you may know, from October 2020, the scheme begins to be phased out and firms had to reapply for support in October and then December. And this is the regime that we call JobKeeper 2.0. And what we find is that essentially the link between reallocation and productivity kind of varies over these two regimes. So we study the characteristics of the firms that take up the subsidy. And as I mentioned earlier, over the first 6 months of the pandemic, under the JobKeeper 1.0 regime, we see that if anything, it's more productive firms, and particularly those that are financially fragile before the pandemic, so had low liquidity, had a high share of fixed costs and expenses, who were more exposed to the shock, they were more likely to take it up. And if anything, when we see that the reallocation productivity link is actually stronger in those local labour markets that had a higher share of the workforce covered by JobKeeper 1.0. And this is even after controlling for the magnitude of the economic shock in local labour markets, or within a given industry in a local labour market. So one way to think about this is that JobKeeper 1.0 may have worked to prevent a premature shakeout of productive firms and correct what could have been a distortive shock in the absence of policy support. Now, the rub is that as you move forward, the characteristics of those firms that continue to take up the subsidy change dramatically. So in a JobKeeper 2.0, if anything, the scheme is now subsidising firms with lower than average productivity. And what we find there is, firstly, in those local labour markets where a large amount of the workforce exits from the scheme, we see a surge in the reallocation from less productive to more productive firms. And the corollary is that in those local labour markets where JobKeeper 2 continues to have a large reach, we see no evidence of productivity enhancing reallocation at all. So one way to think about this is that whilst the scheme initially potentially offered protection, it became more distortive over time. Next slide, thanks, Angus. So I think this is a good way to sort of finish up. What we show here is essentially the baseline regression coefficient at various windows. So since March 2020. So then what we do is we look at what that means for the implied difference in employment growth between a high and low productivity firm. So one with labour productivity 1 standard deviation above the industry mean is high, and one with labour productivity 1 standard deviation below the industry mean is a low productivity firm. And so what we see here is that so over the first 6 months of the pandemic, we see that reallocation remains productivity enhancing, but as the scheme begins to be phased out, we see that this connection between employment changes and firm productivity rises quite significantly. And when the JobKeeper scheme is ultimately removed at the end of March 2021, we see a surge in the reallocation of labour from less productive to more productive firms. So next slide, thanks. So the final thing we do in the single touch payroll paper is to try and look at the implications for aggregate productivity of the reallocation productivity link remaining intact, and also the role of JobKeeper in that. Now, look, I haven't got time to go through this in detail, but the upshot here is that the policy decisions that the Australian government made had material impacts on aggregate productivity. So next slide, thanks, Angus. One way to think about this is that numbers number 1 and 1.8 here basically show that essentially if there was no connection between job reallocation and productivity at all, aggregate labour productivity could have been between 4 and 5.5 percentage points lower in level terms, which is big, right? So that would have been the scenario where we get this indiscriminate shakeout of productive firms. And that would have been a source of significant scarring. Now, what we then estimate is that if JobKeeper 1.0 hadn't been introduced, then you could have lost essentially, up to three points of the level of labour productivity. And that would have come from the fact that in absence of the scheme, you would have had distorted market selection where potentially high productivity firms that may be financially constrained are forced to exit. And finally, what we estimate in the final column is we do a scenario, and we estimate if JobKeeper hadn't been ultimately withdrawn, labour productivity could have been about 2 percentage points lower. So let's not take these numbers literally, but I think the point here is that the impacts of these policy decisions have material aggregate implications. So final slide, thanks Angus, and I'll finish up. So I think there's a number of conclusions from this work. The first is that COVID-19 didn't completely impair the rational market functioning of our economy. So it remained the case that high productivity firms are more likely to expand and low productivity firms were more likely to contract or exit. And that's important, right? Because that process drives medium-term productivity. The work from Zero basically reminds us that that Zero was essentially a technological shock. And even if policy suppressed market dynamism, the nature of the shock was such that it played into the hands of more productive and tech-savvy firms, which triggered a reallocation of labour to such firms. In terms of the messages for job retention schemes, well, I think you could make the case from this that they do have merit as a crisis policy tool, but you better make sure you have an exit strategy because the allocative distortions rise over time and they'll get you. In terms of the implications for productivity, so I think that, initially I was very pessimistic about the impact of COVID on productivity. This work has made me reassess that to some extent. I think what it tells us is that we've so far avoided the worst case scenario, which is a premature shakeout of high productivity firms, which would have entailed the loss of a lot of firm-specific human capital, which is very costly to rebuild, and that would have led to scarring effects. But I think the point here is that, the impact of the pandemic on productivity will only become clearer over time. We know that there's a lot of other less benign channels there, for instance, the impact of school closures on long-term human capital. You've got to be worried about the impact of border closures on global knowledge spillovers, but perhaps on the other side, we get something from accelerated technological adoption. So thanks a lot.
I thank you, Dan, and also Angus. We have, Angus, could you please stop sharing the slides? Thank you. I have some questions from Marla and Joel. Would you both like to put on your cameras so you can ask the questions? Dan, do you want to put your camera on as well?
Sure.
Okay,
Marla,
you've got your microphone on, so would you like to go first?
Yeah, it's just that I want to know to what extent the technological development, when you talk about job destruction, technology plays a role there. Now, because you talked about the crisis period in the 1930s with the GFC, but a lot of the destructions could also be due to the technological disruption, isn't it? So I just want to know your view on that.
Renee, do you want to collect questions or do you want me to answer them as we go?
You can answer them as you go.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, obviously there's a big debate here about the impact of technology on labour markets, right? And we tend to think of that in more secular terms over longer horizons. And I think our contribution here is to sort of look at, over the first 12 to 18 months of the pandemic, is the reallocation that's going on, is that still connected to productivity? Now, that's the main point of the work. Now, but I think you have touched on an important point there, right? There's a lot of concern in policy circles that COVID may accelerate pre-existing trends, right? That places pressure on labour markets. and in particular at a particular point of the income distribution. So, one way to think about this is that over the last 10 or 15 years, we've been worried about, technological change that's sort of makes certain routine tasks redundant, which obviously leads to a hollowing out of the middle part of the income distribution. Now, in the case of the pandemic, you could imagine that could push further down the income distribution, right? So to the extent that some of these behavioral changes associated with the pandemic stick, so there's more work from home, there's less business travel, well, that's got to reduce the demand for low-skilled workers servicing, inner city businesses, right? Hotels, all those types of things. So, that's a pretty kind of pessimistic story, but you could imagine sort of crafting narratives where the pandemic actually kind of accelerates some of these medium-term or secular forces. And that's going to be like a really interesting thing to study, I think, over the next 5 to 10 years. We can't really make a call on that now. I think the best you could do is use something like Burning Glass, right, that looks at kind of job ads and the task content that's being advertised, but we probably need a bit more time to do that.
Joel, would you like to ask your questions next?
Sure, thank you. So thank you, Dan, Jonathan, and Angus. Extremely interesting papers. A couple of questions. So the first one, I think you touched on it a little bit during that presentation there, Dan, but how has the COVID-19 pandemic impacted the extent to which resources shift towards more productive businesses? So I guess with the zero data, you've had the benefit of being able to compare, I guess, within Australia, what it was like in 2019 versus, 2020. But do you have data kind of going further back to be able to see how things, I guess, have been kind of trending over time? And I guess my second question is, does your research shed light on whether JobKeeper style programs in the future should be broad-based or targeted in nature? Just reading through your papers, it seems like you've characterized the shift from JobKeeper 1.0 to 2.0 as being, as basically reflecting or potentially being distortive over time. But I've seen others, they would argue that the initial support measures were poorly targeted and transferring cash to firms that really didn't need support, and that the JobKeeper 2.0 helped correct for some of this over generosity. So I'd be interested to hear your insights into that.
They're two great questions, Joel. Thanks a lot. So on the first one, so with single touch payroll, we don't have the high frequency employment data before the pandemic. But what we do know from using the administrative firm level data sets such as Blade, David Hansel and I have a paper in the Economic Record, it came out a few months ago, that looks at how productivity enhancing labour reallocation has evolved in Australia since the early 2000s. And what we find there is that there's been a material slowing in the reallocation of labour from less productive to more productive firms. And that can account for about 1/4 of the slowdown in labour productivity, which we observe in Australia after 2012. So this is kind of like this was a relevant policy issue before the pandemic. And so then we obviously try to shed light on what's happened since the onset of COVID. So I think that, in terms of basically making those kind of longer term sort of comparisons, we're going to need more data. And obviously sort of having that annual data come through will be important in that regard. Look, the second question, right, is a really important policy question. I was in the Treasury at the time, and you've got to understand that, when basically house is on fire, you've got to do something, right? And the big concern then was about macroeconomic stimulus and sort of putting a floor under confidence. So I think that, I wouldn't want to sort of, I think that was appropriate at the time. I think what matters here is how you come at this question, right? If you come at this from a macroeconomic perspective, you're probably going to think about it differently to if you sort of come at it from the perspective of firm heterogeneity. And I think we can't say for sure what would have happened if they hadn't introduced JobKeeper, right? So you could have had a lot of scarring in the first 6 months because some of our best firms have to shed labour or exit.
Thank you. Roseanne, would you like to ask your question?
Yes, Renee, thank you very much. also, Dan, thank you very much. One positive thing I saw that was posted on the internet by Postal Vinay, the labor economist from UCL, was that the shift or the movements or the flows from unemployment to employment is falling in the US as of late in the past few months, while the job-to-job flows, which can be a good indicator of, if you like, some reallocation, better reallocation of labor resources has been going up. That maybe is one good news. But my main question is about both in these administrative data and zero data, we know little about the hours worked, how many hours people work. Probably during COVID with lockdowns and everything, the hours have become much more volatile. And I wonder how much we can save if we don't know how many hours someone worked by knowing what they are paid. Thank you, Dan.
Yeah. Thank you, Azad. So this is a point that I neglected to make due to time. So in Zero, we have a proxy for hours worked at the firm level. So what we do in that paper is we run the baseline specification focusing on the intensive margin, right? So hours worked at the firm level as a function of firm productivity. And what we find is a very similar story. So, you know, in broad terms, low productivity firms are more likely to cut hours, and high productivity firms are more likely to kind of keep hours at a similar or slightly reduced level. So, you know, although in the case of the pandemic, where you do have these job retention schemes where people are still getting paid but not actually working, you know, you can still get the same result. And I think this is one of the real novelties of Zero, right? Like all the firm level data sets I've worked with don't have hours worked. And those same data sets are, you know, the most recent year is 2019, right? So this is like a real innovative data set from that perspective.
Well, oops. Okay, we just have some more questions that are in the Q&A. The first one is from Curtin Lees. So he says, New Zealand is now in a second round of tight lockdown. What would you recommend to policymakers for what our wage subsidy scheme should look like now?
Oh boy, all right. That's an interesting question, right? I haven't been following the New Zealand debate too much. I think that clearly you have to think about the geographical nature of this, right? So and also, you know, like as a general point, right? Like I think we're at a very different point now to where we were in March 2020. So if you go back a year and a half or so, like there was a lot of uncertainty over the evolution of the virus, right? So we didn't really know what we were dealing with. There was no possibility, we didn't even know about the possibility of vaccines at that point, right? So I think as a general point, you know, these type of job retention schemes are probably appropriate back then. Or you could make the case, right, to maintain the connection between workers and firms, so you could build a bridge between the pre-pandemic and post-pandemic economy. Now, the thing is that the longer the shock lasts, I think the case for preservation over reallocation declines. And, you know, like this is going to be with us for some time yet. And whenever we kind of, you know, adopt measures that bind workers to firms, you know, we have to think about the incentives that creates to actually adapt to sort of the post-pandemic world. You know, as I mentioned before, if basically greater work from home sticks, well, that means big changes for firms' business models. So, you know, I think that basically, you know, targeted policy measures, you know, in light of the sort of rollout of Delta, that, you know, help firms in hard-hit sectors cover their fixed costs is good policy. I think that targeted policy measures that shield the incomes of those workers that can't go to work because of the pandemic. So I'm particularly thinking those in hard-hit sectors centered on in-person services where teleworking isn't a viable option is probably good policy. But, you know, the idea of basically binding workers to firms perpetually, you know, becomes increasingly costly over time. So I think, we have to kind of think about where we are now relative to where we were 12 to 18 months ago.
Great, thank you. We have just 2 other questions in the chat, so I'll just read them both and then I think you can answer them together. The first is from Sushil Padel. What kind of firms were taken for analysis? Does it include a mix of manufacturing, service and agriculture, or only some specific types of firms? And then Russian Fernando writes, how pronounced are the productivity effects have been across industries, energy, manufacturing and service?
Okay, so what I should say is that both of these data sets are broadly representative of the industrial structures of these economies. So, taking, Xero, although this is focused on the small business community, you've got very good coverage across all sectors, including those hard hit sectors. And, importantly, so we're not really missing anything there, right? Single touch payroll is a similar story for Australia. So, we kind of focus on sectoral heterogeneity to the extent that we think it's meaningful in the context of the COVID shock. So clearly COVID has asymmetric sectoral characteristics because, a lot of us can still telework, right? But if you're working in person, services, that's a lot more problematic. So we focused on the sectoral dimension to the extent that we thought it was relevant to the shock. And the second question, Renee, was about energy, was it?
How pronounced are the productivity effects across industries, energy, manufacturing and service? You can read them in the Q&A if you...
So, can I? Okay, sorry. Yeah, look, we haven't kind of looked at that in the context of COVID because I think, as I said before, there's other sectoral questions that you look at sooner given the nature of the shock. But what we know in trend terms is that there are differences in the extent of productivity enhancing reallocation across sectors. So certainly those sectors that are more open to international trade, such as manufacturing, tend to have a much stronger link between workforce adjustments and firm productivity. The flip side of that is that if you're in kind of sheltered domestic services, you tend to see more evidence of misallocation, right? So it's a lot easier for low productivity firms to survive when there's less competition in the economy.
Okay, and just the last question is from Nick Melbury. He says, hey Dan, what insight can you share in relation to Canada? They have a more complicated policy approach, regular unemployment insurance, a longer running job retention subsidy, and now a hiring subsidy. Any plans for further analysis?
So we don't have data on Canada at the moment, but watch this space. Xero has moved into North America. And they have offices in Canada, also a number of offices in the US. So I think that could be something that we could look to address going forward, Nick, once we get more data. And I'd also be interested to know if there's any work in Canada, using the Stats Canada admin data on this. But at the moment, right, I can't really comment on that because I don't have any evidence, and I like to sort of make, my comments, I want them to be empirically founded, right? So I don't have that much to say about that at the moment.
Okay then, great, thank you. I think we'll wrap up there. So thank you, Dan and Angus as well for stepping in with zero notice to give that presentation. And it was really interesting work. So please join me at home to thank Dan for his interesting presentation.